Sapsan missile. Okay, this was something that the Ukrainians, it was said, were developing themselves. And they had, I think, with four enterprises, two in Sumy, two in Dnipropetrovsk, and they had production lines set up. And it's just described as a long-range missile. Now, it was also mentioned in in the stories about it that there was maybe German involvement in this project, German oversight. So you wonder, there was this story, I think, that came out a few months ago that the Germans were going to help the Ukrainians develop a missile and produce it within Ukraine. And this may be very well what that story was about. Now, again, with these missile strikes, apparently the Russians have just completely destroyed this project. But there was a similar story that came out. They said there was a missile called the Flamingo, which was supposed to have a cruise missile of with a range of 3,000 kilometers, and it was, according to the Associated Press, developed by Ukraine. But I have a more than sneaking suspicion that the Germans or maybe the Americans, the British, were actually very heavily involved in this. And I think we can see that maybe this is a new strategy after the attempt to use ATACMS. Well, that was shelved. First of all, it wasn't successful. Let's be honest. It did very little. But it also did risk serious retaliation and escalation by the Russians. And the Trump administration seems to have put an end to this. So maybe this is an alternative strategy. Okay, well we're going to have Ukrainian developed missiles, which maybe really aren't Ukrainian developed, but that's what we can present them as, and therefore we can avoid the risk of escalation. We can have a cruise missile fired from Ukraine, and we say, well, this was a Ukrainian missile. It hit Moscow, but it has nothing to do, with NATO. So Russia, you have no reason to strike a NATO base or anything. I think that's maybe what we're seeing. This is a new tack that they're taking, and the Russians have at least apparently have completely obliterated this one target. This other one, the Flamingo missile, is more mysterious. I don't know where it's happening, and it maybe not even in Ukraine, but they're trying to pretend that it's Ukrainian. We'll see. But it shows that there are elements in the West that haven't given up on escalation.
I also saw on the news that Russia blew up some Azerbaijani gas station in Odessa. Did you see that?
Yeah.
Is there something going on here? Because I know Azerbaijan supplies gas to Israel. And we have Azerbaijan and Armenia with the Zangezur corridor. Something fishy is going on there. It looks like these two countries in the Caucasus are being used as part of this U.S. hegemonic proxy mission to either attack Russia or Iran. Is there some kind of relationship between these three countries, Azerbaijan, Israel, Ukraine? This seems to be like our axis of evil that are being funded and controlled by the globalists, the U.S. hegemonic elite.
Oh yeah, there's no question that there's a very tight relationship between Israel and Azerbaijan. I think 70% of weapons, of Azerbaijani weaponry actually have been purchased in Israel so far. They have a very tight relationship. The Israeli intelligence, I think is deeply involved in Azerbaijan. And again, there was indications that attacks were carried out from Azerbaijani territory against Iran during the recent 12-day war. Azerbaijan and Israel are very, very tight. Now, and Israel also supports Ukraine. I don't know if they're really a very important supporter of Ukraine, but they have supported Ukraine in this war. Now, Azerbaijan is clearly supporting Ukraine. Up until recently, up until like a month ago or so, the Russians actually avoided striking the Azerbaijan-owned facilities in Ukraine. And I think maybe there was a hope that this, Russian goodwill would be reciprocated by Azerbaijan, but then it became clear that it wasn't, and so the Russians have decided, not to spare these facilities. In general, they've been striking the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. That's part of their, strategy of just weakening the military industrial complex, such as it is in Ukraine. And they had made an exception for Azerbaijan, but it's just clear that Azerbaijan wasn't reciprocating. Was leaning strongly towards Ukraine, and and I think there's more than that. We had that the arrests of Azerbaijani criminals within Russia, and these criminals, were part of criminal, networks apparently. And there is some talk that maybe these criminal networks actually worked with the Ukrainians, like, for example, during the Operation Spiderweb and maybe other operations within Russia. So I think the Russians decided, like, to hell with it. There's just no, that we're we're not getting any benefit from, nothing but anything but goodwill from the Azerbaijanis. So, okay, yeah, we'll start. So that's why we're seeing the strikes on their facilities.
Is that a potential flashpoint though? If Russia starts attacking, Azerbaijani facilities. I mean, Azerbaijan is a small country, but this is another U.S. proxy. I mean, part of me is wondering, it's like the U.S. might just be trying to compartmentalize things. They're thinking like, okay, well, we were trying to deal with Iran and Yemen and China and everything, so let's just stop Ukraine, and then but we can't. We got to strengthen our other proxies. Is that something that you think?
Yeah,
that
well,
might
it shows.
be,
I think that
at least the mindset of some people.
Right. Yeah, I think maybe. Yeah, there's no reason to think that that in general the kind of the project to weaken and contain Russia is going to come to an end. Say Ukraine was the main part of that project, but that has clearly failed. And so the more realistic members of the U.S. government, of the the foreign policy and military elite there are coming to terms with that, but I don't think there's any reason to think that they're going to stop all their other projects, in the South Caucasus, for example, and places like Azerbaijan, that they will continue there. Now we had that that deal that well, it was not quite a deal. This is important to recognize. There was a deal that was made between Armenia and Azerbaijan. That a peace treaty was basically signed for them, which was really very much in the favor of Azerbaijan. And then there was a statement of intent. It was really no more than that, on the creation of the so-called Zangezur corridor, along the southern border of Armenia, where Armenia borders Iran. And the idea, of course, was to lease this southern strip of territory to the U.S. for 99 years. Now, but that hasn't happened, and maybe it never will. One thing is, like, we've seen all these deals, so many of these deals that Trump has made, and there's always, it's this, whether it's with the Japanese or the Europeans or whoever, whomever, there's always this very bombastic statement by Trump. He's made this incredible deal. There will be hundreds of billions of dollars investment, and so on and so forth. And then when you look at it carefully, you find, well, actually, there's some talk of it, but there's actually no concrete promises, or no real treaty signed, and maybe in some cases really no means to implement these promises, or to make sure that the promises are implemented. So both Armenia and Azerbaijan declared this intent. And maybe it really will happen, but maybe it won't. We'll see. If it does, then yeah, it does spell trouble especially for Iran. That you would have the opportunity for the U.S. to put, its assets directly on the border with Iran there. Um, Again, no deal has been made yet, but it is very threatening to Iran, and it does threaten, Russia's position in the region. Russia has military bases in Armenia now, but it looks like that those bases will not remain for long.
Interesting. So we know that there's a close relationship between Azerbaijan and Israel. The relationship between Ukraine and Israel, I feel like there's something there, but I'm not sure. And one of the reasons I feel that way is because when I was looking at previous prime ministers of Israel, most of them are from the Ukraine. And Zelensky's half Jewish as well. It seems like there are a lot of Ukrainians living in Israel. There are a lot of Ukrainians and a lot of Russians as well. But I just feel like maybe I'm wrong, but we talk about CIA and MI6 involvement in Ukraine, but I have a feeling that maybe Israel, they operate in the shadows a lot. I wonder like how heavily involved is Mossad, and if how much of the U.S. foreign policy is being dictated by by Israel. At least we know it is in the Middle East, but is it being influenced beyond that? That there's this merging between the Zionists, our U.S. hegemonist as well. They're just I feel like there's something there, but maybe I'm wrong.
You may be right. Again, it's like you say, these are things happening in the shadows, so we just don't know. There clearly is a relationship, and the Israelis have been supportive of Ukraine. But they haven't been one of the major supporters of Ukraine, and they have tried to maintain, at least minimally decent relations with the Russians. Now, their relationship with Russia has been strained, really, ever since October 7th, but it hasn't broken. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't see how it would be really very much in the interests of Israel to get too much involved in Ukraine. This is, maybe there's something there, especially like if there may be some give and take, like the Americans ask for Israeli help, or the Ukrainians and the Israelis will do a favor because they know they can get a favor in return. Maybe that kind of thing is probably happening in the shadows. So I don't know what exactly is happening.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's move over a little bit to Israel. You were saying as well earlier before we started the conversation about these huge protests in Israel. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, there were some major protests. I think the largest in at least a year in Tel Aviv. At least 100,000, and maybe 300,000 people went out on the streets. But there were major protests in other cities in Israel, and altogether. So we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people on the streets. And what they're demanding is a ceasefire and a return of the hostages. That's what it's all about. It's the hostages, and what everybody understands is that really the only way to get the hostages back, to be sure that they can get them back, is through a ceasefire. That's how, so far that's the hostages that have been released. Again, we call them hostages, but let's be honest, many of them are simply prisoners of war. We fall into this use, like on the Palestinians prisoners, we refer to them as prisoners. Many of them are, I think, fairly could be called hostages. The people that are just simply seized by the Israelis, without charges. A great, I think the majority of them, in fact, are. And then in the case of the Israelis, well, these are soldiers, many of them, the majority of them, who are seized in a military operation. Normally, we call them prisoners of war. Somehow we always call them hostages in Israel. So, they call them hostages. I think they're more fairly called prisoners of war. And there are maybe 25 or so remaining that are known to be alive. And that's what these protests are about. There's a real focus on Israeli society, a great part of Israeli society on the hostages. And, that's been a a point of contention between Netanyahu and his coalition. That's been a sort of a, a vulnerable point, because so many people are upset about that. And he has clearly been, pursuing policies that are not conducive to the return of the hostages. The continuation of the war satisfies the extremist elements in his coalition, and I think of his own ambitions. Um, but it doesn't. It clearly makes less likely the return of the hostages. So this is something that he's vulnerable on. But there are a lot of Israelis who really want those hostages back, and he's feeling the pressure. But I don't think he's going to. So far, he's showing no signs of caving in. He still has this plan to occupy Gaza City. I think the worry is that the occupation of Gaza City will lead to the deaths of more hostages. And that's quite possible. Of course, these protesters, unfortunately, don't seem to be concerned about they're very concerned about the 25 Israeli prisoners of war, but they're not concerned about, the many thousands, tens of thousands of, and even you could say hundreds of thousands of Palestinian lives that will be endangered by this operation.